Good morning, dudes and dudettes. One take. Everybody knows the rule. I hope all of you have been having a fantastic day. For today, we're going to try to wrap up the overall concepts of Unit 3 into what is the most important concept of Unit 3, which is going to be political participation. Political participation is the antithesis, the peak of what we're focusing on, because the overall idea of Unit 3 is trying to talk about the value that the citizens have inside of a governmental regime. And we focused on the civil society, we talked about political ideologies, and now it all comes down to actually how do citizens participate inside of their government. Because at the end of the day, if you're not part of the actual government, you can't really participate. As well, we have to remember we're not focusing just on the perspective of voting. There's so many other ways to participate inside of politics outside of just voting. So what we're focusing on is the two main types of political participation. You have voluntary and you have kind of like forced, is the general idea here. And the overall idea is that this can happen at the grand level. You can have these massive protests like what are happening currently inside of many countries over the war in Iran, or the immigration issues, or what Japan just had a huge protest because there was a mosque being built next to a temple, and they felt that that was kind of disrespectful. So these political participation can be voluntary on huge levels. The overall idea of political participation is just to focus on their why they're happening and the reaction of the government. So we're saying that if a government's supportive of political participation, that is probably going to be a more democratic perspective, right? That's probably going to be something that is not seen as much in authoritarian regimes. What we also can say is that certain conditions that are happening inside of society are going to be pushing individuals to become more violent. So whether that be the government becoming violent towards protesters or violent towards citizens, or the citizens becoming violent towards the government. The overall idea is that what we can say almost across the board for democratic or authoritarian regimes is that citizens participate in forms of participation that are more aggressive due to the fact that they don't feel that they're being heard. They don't feel that normal political participation is ineffective or just not possible, right? An example could be is if you're a person in Nigeria and you are a tribal religion, and you realize it's just impossible for your religion to ever become the president of the country because the vast majority of the population is Islam or Christian, you might just feel that your political participation is ineffective. So you go and do political participation yourself, whether that be creating a lobbying organization, whether that be getting a bunch of people together to go protest, something along those lines. Generally speaking, we can say that across both authoritarian and democratic regimes is that political participation is the most potent or the most violent when people don't believe that their voice is being heard, or they believe that their current legal participation is ineffective. So what ends up happening is that we have the how do you do this political participation, and you have the formal route and you have the informal route. So you have the formal political participation, which is going to be in almost every circumstance is just going to be voting, doing some form of election. Outside of that, there's not many formal political participations that a general citizen can do. The idea of voting in the perfect world is going to be that they are going to enhance legitimacy we always have to come back to some of those favorite words, right? We have legitimacy, sovereignty, power, right? So how does voting impact this? It really impacts legitimacy, because if the citizens vote in their leader, people find it more legitimate. It also protects citizens' values, because hopefully the person that they're voting in is agreeing with what the citizens are stating. Clearly, that's maybe not always what's really happening. And then finally, the most important part of this formal political participation is it's a check, right? The most beautiful thing that has been created in modern history has been the checks and balance system inside of governments. And the best check and balance is when the citizens actually get to vote for their political leader. Generally speaking, though, that is leaning democratic. Yes, authoritarian regimes do have voting. On a general perspective, authoritarian regimes are a little bit less transparent with their voting systems. So when we are thinking about the authoritarian regime and the formal political participation of voting, a lot of the times there is a illusion of influence, where a lot of the times the authoritarian regime has the formal political participation of voting, but in reality the vote is either manipulated, it is changed, or it just doesn't do anything. And that is where issues arise, potentially, right? So we have that formal political participation that the regular individuals do. An example of a more authoritarian would be in Iran and their Green Revolution over the voting of their president, which the citizens voted in. I think he got like 60% of the votes or something along those lines. And then the government said, no, we don't want that person as president anymore. And there was a large protest behind that, because they were like, we voted him in, why would he not be president? And then there was a huge protest after that. So you can look into that yourself if you would like to. The other example of formal political participation is something called a referenda, which is just a direct vote. So generally the way politics works inside of modern society is citizens vote for a person. That person makes decisions about important topics for us. And that's called a representative democracy, right? They represent our ideas. A referenda is getting rid of the representative part of that. Is literally just a direct vote, is that the citizens directly vote for a question. And this is used typically for incredibly important decisions, because generally speaking, that is a little bit more serious, a referenda, but naturally, as we know, when it comes to voting, most people don't vote, generally speaking. So with a referenda, even though it's super important, you're still not going to get 100% of people voting. You would be lucky if you get 75. So the best example would be Brexit. Brexit was a referenda. There was also the Scottish referenda. There was a lot of referenda inside of the United Kingdom. But the overall idea is that the United Kingdom used the referenda perspective on Brexit because it's such an important decision. But they did like 4 referenda to actually get Brexit to happen, and that was because every single time it was either they lost the referendum, like just generally speaking, they just lost it, they didn't get enough votes, or there wasn't enough political participation, or there was some other. It was a bit bad on how it ended up turning out, and now we're here, and they have to deal with Brexit now. So overall, when we're talking about political participation, their formal political participation, there's really only 2. There is voting and referenda we really only see in the United Kingdom. We don't really see that in many other countries inside of our course countries. So generally speaking, voting is the only form of formal political participation that we're talking about inside of, I guess you want to say, our course countries. The next would be informal. And the overall idea of informal political participation is just allowing for people to advocate for different views. Overall, this form of informal political participation is going to be now, generally speaking, more leaning towards the aggressive perspectives, right? So this is now your perspective as a human of what do we deem as aggressive? Do we do peaceful protesting? Does that count as an aggressive form of political participation? Because some countries would see that as aggressive. So it's hard to state exactly what is aggressive and what is not, because each country deems it differently. But what we can say from a general perspective is that a form of protest is going to be this informal, aggressive political participation, because we know in certain authoritarian regimes, they are not going to allow that to happen. They're going to fight against that. They're going to kill people. They're going to attack people for just protesting. And that tells us it is aggressive by nature. As a Westerner, that's just not necessarily how we think, because protesting is so common inside of our societies. But we have to remember, it's not about our society. It's about the course countries. So overall, these informal political participation is going to be typically more seen in democratic regimes, but more valued in authoritarian regimes. And overall, the idea here is that in authoritarian regimes, elections are more often manipulated. So the ending result is that now there's going to be more protests for those manipulated elections, but the authoritarian regime's reaction to elections is more aggressive. So it's a catch-22. It's due to the fact that formal political participation is being manipulated, informal political participation increases. Due to a higher informal political participation, the aggression of the government follows. So it's kind of like they did it to themselves. If they just had a more natural and honest formal political participation, the government would not have to be as aggressive towards those protests. So the example is that if you are critical of the government's viewpoints, if you are protesting, if you're vocal against the political systems, if you are just doing something that just angers the government, they are much more likely to come after you. And even though the goal is formal political participation inside of the democratic regimes, there's still a lot of informal political participation inside of democratic regimes. There's violent protests. There's definitely very strong civil societies. There's definitely people angry with their governments in both democratic and authoritarian regimes. The difference is that a democratic regime is much more likely to be friendly, I guess is the word I'm going to use, to protesting, while the authoritarian regime is typically less tolerant of this political protest or these aggressive anti-elite or anti-leadership perspectives inside of these protests. And I think that is also something really important to talk about when it comes to the current political state of the United States of America. I know that is not a course country, but I do think it gives us a great perspective of showing how different a single leader can take protesting, right? If we go back to early 2000s with Bush or Obama, whenever there's protests, they never sent the military to go attack them. Currently, that did happen in America. And that tells us that we are moving authoritarian, right? Naturally, because that's what that says, right? That's what we've found with comparative government, is that regimes that do not tolerate political protests or movements are less democratic. And previously, it was very rare to ever see mass violent protests in America. Yes, there definitely was in certain cities, right? But it was less common. In today's America, it's much more common, which tells us, if we just we can maybe argue that we are going in a direction of authoritarianism rather than staying truly more democratic. And the reason is because when people see or feel that their individual liberties or civil rights are being damaged, they will become more aggressive. All right. Hope all of you have a great rest of your day. Sleep well, eat well, have fun.